And we're having this this talk basically on the initiative of Johannes, who you can see. I think he's above me, but I don't know. Can I? If I'm pointing to him, do you all see him there?
I'm right here. Yep.
He's there. He said, okay, why don't we talk about the COVID-19 in relation to the agricultural rural development, and what can we do as a community? Because I think we are here as a community of implementers, of researchers, as donors as well, and let's have a discussion on that. So we quickly mobilized. Unfortunately, we don't have an input by USAID on this. We sent around the article, but it was just not possible to organize that so quickly. But Johannes, as somebody who kickstarted this, he also said, okay, then I will do some inputs and kickstart this discussion. So really thanks to Johannes, also thanks to Julie, who's also here. I see her below me now, for really taking the initiative there. And well, I'm just basically moderating it a little bit. So I think we have already 15 participants, which are probably too many to have a round of introduction, but maybe if we do a very quick one. Can we do a very quick one? And I have a list here that goes kind of alphabetically. No, it doesn't go alphabetically. It goes alphabetically. So maybe Arwen, do you want to quickly check in and say who you are, where you work? Arwen? No? Okay. Then I have here Florence.
Sorry, hello.
Oh, it's Arwen, go ahead.
Sorry, I was muted. Arwen Bailey, and I'm in Rome, Italy, week 3 of lockdown, and I work at the Alliance of Biodiversity and CIMMYT.
Great. Oh, no, okay, now the list changed. I have here Atsuko. Atsuko, can you quickly introduce yourself?
Oh, hi. My name is Atsuko Toda. I'm the Director for Ag Finance at the African Development Bank. Thank you.
Excellent. Florence?
Florence Reed. I'm with Sustainable Harvest International, working with smallholder farmers in Central America.
Great. Then I have somebody called FRG. FRG. Otherwise, we move on to Jesse. Jesse, can you introduce yourself? No? Okay. Kyle Murphy.
Hi, this is Kyle Murphy. I manage the agriculture sector at J. Powell at MIT.
Excellent. Larry?
Larry Cooley from Management Systems International in the Community of Practice.
Okay. Michael, good to have you.
Hi, everyone. Michael Hauser, ICRISAT. I'm leading the social sciences here at ICRISAT. I'm based in Nairobi, calling from Nairobi.
Margaret?
Yes, nice to meet you for the first time. My name is Margaret Will. I'm a private sector consultant.
Okay, great. Sean, we were actually supposed to have a scaling conference in Mexico, but today. But I'm happy that you're online. You want to introduce yourself, Sean?
Yeah, hi Lennart. This is it though, isn't it? This is the scaling thing. It's the new conference. Anyway, Sean Ferris, Agriculture CRS.
Great. Simon, also a blogger.
Hi, yes, about to post something on the website today as well. Simon Winter, Executive Director at the Syngenta Foundation for Sustainable Agriculture.
All right. Sunil?
Hi, Sunil Himdev from the Syngenta Foundation based in Basel.
Great. And there's somebody called GMART. Oh, GMART? No? Julie, I think you were the last one on my list, Julie. And Maria then.
Hello, my name is Maria Boa. I'm working at CIMMYT with Lennart Woltering and based in Mexico.
Okay, Julie, you want to say who you are? No, okay. Then I think let's move on and start with the introduction.
Hi, Lennart, you missed me. I'm Martin Fregene, Director of Agriculture and Agro-Industry at the African Development Bank.
Okay, great, thank you. Anybody else who I missed?
Yes,
Benjamin,
my name is Ed Mabaya, Manager for Agribusiness Development, also at the African Development Bank.
Excellent, excellent.
It's good to hear
Benjamin?
some familiar voices.
Benjamin, I think, okay, maybe Julie, you want to introduce yourself, and then I think we move on.
Sure, Julie Howard. I'm a senior advisor and I'm resident at the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
Thanks, and also the architect of this session. Thank you so much. Johannes, you want to kick off the session? Maria will help you with the slides. So I give the floor to you. I mute my microphone. If others can also please mute, thanks.
Can you hear me, Lennart? Okay.
Yes.
So, yeah, well, let me introduce myself. I'm Johannes Lin. I'm with Brookings and a few other places. And I've been working over the last few years, last sort of 10, 15 years on and off with IFAD in Rome, assisting as the chair of the replenishments. And it was this year, I'm not chairing the replenishments, which are going on right now, but I've been asked to provide occasional advice and input given previous engagement. And so I was asked just about 2 or 3 days ago to put together some thoughts about how the COVID crisis might affect the agricultural, rural development, food security area, and particularly how that might affect the replenishment process for IFAD, which is currently ongoing. It started with a meeting in February in Rome still. The next meeting is supposed to be in June, but will be a virtual meeting most likely. It's supposed to finish by December, but of course nobody quite knows how all of this will transpire and how the process of replenishment discussions will be affected. So it's based on some of the preliminary thoughts that I put together very quickly, and I should say as a non-expert. In fact, can we move on to the next slide, please, Maria? There we are. So I've been asked to put something together for them. I'm not an expert. That's my personal disclaimer at the bottom of my introduction here. So I actually look forward to this discussion because you all are the experts, and I hope we can kick off some discussion that is not only helpful to us all, but ultimately also actually for our colleagues at IFAD. Unfortunately, I don't think anybody's joining from IFAD. Because they're in the middle of a senior management discussion actually on how to move forward. So, but I promised to brief them, so there will be some feedback to IFAD. So just very briefly, background. So of course, we're all individually affected by what's happening, more or less. We're all, I think, based currently in our private homes and in our home offices. And of course, our institutions are all affected, affected by this. The institutions we work for, IFAD, for example, has been shut down for, I believe, for the last 3 weeks already, and is, of course, in the middle of the crisis, just physically, given that they're based in Rome and Italy. There's, of course, a sort of immediate focus on the policy community and the political arena on the immediate health and economic crisis. But I think it's also worth remembering that there, of course, are other impacts in other development areas, including poverty, education, food security, agricultural development, and so on, and more generally on sort of how development finance works, and as, for example, replenishment for IFAD under the current circumstances, and how organizations that work in the development space, the multilateral ones, the bilateral ones, the NGOs, such as we have Florence here from who's from that part of the world, so to speak. How are we all affected by this? And specifically now, and this is what I want to talk about, and I've been asked to talk about the next 5 to 7 minutes, in the agricultural development, food security area. And for this group, I think what I hope we can focus on is there anything we can contribute or learn as the agricultural development scaling up working group that is, of course, part of the broader community of practice on scaling up that Larry Cooley and I have now worked on for the last 5-6 years with a lot of input from a lot of people. Let's go to the next slide and straight into the substantive issues that we're facing in the agricultural development and food security area, as far as I can tell. And as I said, I'm not the expert here, so I hope you all have a lot more useful insights than I can contribute. But I think maybe we should start with a realization, and that's actually everybody I've been reading about or heard from agrees, that poor rural communities in developing countries are particularly vulnerable under these circumstances. They are suffering from the impacts of economic recession, which reduces, among other things, the demand for agricultural products and hence rural incomes. The volatility of commodity and food prices are difficult to predict, but the prices are difficult to predict, but it's clear that during this crisis and its aftermath, these prices will be especially volatile, which will in one way or another impact the rural production, investment, incomes, and consumption. Farmers and governments will depend on efficient information flows to function under these circumstances, and governments will want to find ways to try and stabilize prices. So the whole question of commodity and food prices will in one way or another play a significant role. Next slide, please. Then there's a whole question about how food supply chains will be affected. Actually, this morning, if you read the Financial Times, there's quite an interesting article that takes the pasta industry as the sort of example, but also talks a bit about fruit and vegetable in terms of global supply chains. I show that picture on the right that gives a good indication how the wheat from Canada goes to Italy, from Italy then to distribution final consumers in the UK as a particular example, and how many steps are involved where things can go wrong. And the article is quite informative on flagging some of these concerns. Now, more generally, I think we see disruptions potential and actual in trade and transport, access to labor and non-labor inputs, and of course in processing and distribution of outputs. This all is reinforced by panic selling and buying and maybe hoarding on the input and output side. And we of course see this, everyone I'm sure sees this in their grocery stores as one particular aspect, but we can just imagine how this more generally percolates through the system. Now, in this particular context, I'm not an expert on this at all, but it seems that the green channels in China actually seem to have been reasonably successful in sort of keeping food supply and distribution chains open. So that's just one thought here to throw on the table. Next slide, please. There are, of course, other impacts, short and medium, longer term, interruptions in rural public services and rural infrastructure, including construction and also operation and maintenance, disruption of rural credit flows, reduced engagement by large national, international, private agricultural and food producers and distributors to the extent they play in some countries a significant role. There are restrictions now on seasonal migration of agricultural labor. That can be significant in some countries where the loss of earnings and increase in rural employment will significantly affect rural communities. Next slide, please. There are other relevant impacts, including decline in remittances from cross-border migrants, which tend to be particularly flowing to rural communities in Central America, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and parts of Africa, and which very likely will dry up during the crisis as receiving countries close borders, face economic recession, and fiscal financial stress. And of course, the impact on the rural communities could be significant. And then, not quite finally, there's a reduced focus, very likely, at least for the short term, on ARD and food security in not only domestically in each country, but also internationally, as I think the international aid community, and we see it probably this morning in the G7, in the G20 call. I haven't yet seen what happened, but I'm sure, you know, agriculture, rural development, food security was not at the top of the agenda. It was probably more health and related matters, but this will also, could easily affect the national budgets with reduced aid budgets because domestic priorities need a lot of spending, as we see in the US. There could be reduced public and private support for assisting rural communities abroad. And of course, in sort of the sectoral distribution of aid flows, there may be more attention of aid on health and related matters and less in agricultural rural rural development, which could directly affect for example, the replenishment of EFAT and other food and agriculture related windows of assistance. Finally, I'd like to throw out a thought that occurred to me, and I haven't really seen much of this yet discussed in any of the literature that I've been keeping track of off and on. And this is that, you know, this coronavirus crisis, of course, flags a high global risk from zoonotic diseases, the SARS and other prior MERS and so on have already given us a taste. This is now a even more significant zoonotic disease, and in a sense we're lucky because yes, it's highly contagious, but at least fortunately the death rate seems to be and incidence of illness seems to be, of serious illness seems to be, relatively speaking, still not that high compared to some of the other such illnesses. So you know, there is now the question, how do we actually prevent similar recurring and possibly even more severe outbreaks of this kind through effective regulation, supervision of livestock producers, pastoralists, animal markets, animal waste disposal, etc., and maybe community food consumption in areas where this is a risk. At the same time, however, maintaining some balance between limiting the health risks and supporting the informal and small livestock producers and traders. And actually, I don't know whether this is an area where the research community is very active. I suspect it is, but taking this from the research into the more explicitly into the policy domain may well be now becoming a much more urgent matter than we had thought of in the past. So I think next slide. Okay, let me end with some questions for you all. I hope we can discuss this now in the next 40 minutes or so and maybe beyond. So are these impacts that I came up with as a non-expert, are they indeed the most important, and which other ones may matter that I didn't even mention, and which ones should we forget about? What are we doing about them? What analysis is ongoing? What action would be appropriate? Are there specific aspects of the problem that we can perhaps as a community respond to because they relate specifically to the scaling of agenda that we care about? And of course, the scale of the problem is huge. Now, what does that mean for scaling in terms of the response and the approach that one pursues? And what can we as the working group in this area, what can we do to address these issues and draw hopefully important lessons for the future? Lennart, let me stop here. I don't know whether I kicked the ball effectively down the field, and I will just happily listen now. Thank you. Over.
Yeah, thank you so much, Johannes. Great presentation, and I think it frames the discussion quite well. Are there some immediate questions or remarks on the presentation or understanding questions? Please just chat or raise your voice. Florence, please.
There's one question. There was a reference to green markets, I believe it was, or green channels, excuse me, in China. I'm not familiar with that term. Could you explain what green channels are?
I will try as best I can, because I haven't investigated in any detail. Maybe others know more about it, but I understand that China, as it dealt with a crisis, set up specific distribution and distribution access networks for food and agricultural and food products that basically work their way through the otherwise blocked distribution channels for other products or goods and products. That's my understanding. How they worked in detail and what one can learn from them, both positive, what to do and what not to do, to be honest, I have no idea, but there may be others who can help you with.
Okay, thanks. Any more questions on specifically, or otherwise I would like to ask you, does this resonate with everybody? Does it people feel something is missing, or there's a kind of like a different situation maybe where you are, or how your organization is approaching this? Maybe some reactions on that. Please go ahead.
Maybe Lennart, can I come in? This is Atsuko from the African Development Bank. Okay, great. First of all, thanks a lot, Johannes, for the presentation. I was just wondering, just because I think there is a kind of overall feeling that this is a massive threat to all sectors, but to be granular, I feel like there might be a difference between the impacts on global supply chains vis-a-vis regional and domestic. And because in Africa, there's a huge effort to try to get more domestic regional value chains going, linking them from production to processing, there might be an argument to be made there. That's one. Two, as the demand for consumer goods and food is relatively inelastic, I'm just wondering what the impact of the different policies that governments are taking. So there have been governments whereby they're not closing the entire economies vis-a-vis those that are just going into lockdown, and there's different phases. Once we go into lockdown, the markets close, and therefore then really it's the markets are closed. And so therefore there's a huge impact on agribusiness. But as long as the markets stay open, I feel like food products per se are inelastic. Thirdly, if I was just wondering also, just because we're working with different crops, and and I noticed everybody's working with different crops, I think there's a huge difference between import and export. And so if we could also look at high value vis-a-vis staple crops, there's a bit of conversation to be made there. And then if we link it to the macroeconomic picture and the impact that inflation and forex scarcity could have with regards to the liquidity that's available for the agribusinesses and for the where the demand pool is coming, I think that may be interesting. And then finally, just on the regional differences as a group, if we could really look at the different regions as well, and the way Africa is playing into this scenario is very different from Asia as Latin America, and that could also give it some color with regards to when we go from impact to some of the questions around what we should be doing. Thank you.
Some great points. Any reaction from maybe from the group on some of the points? I don't want to push everything to Johannes. He was already so kind to present.
Lennart, can I come in, Julie? Yeah, so Atsuko, thanks a lot for those comments. And Johannes, thanks very much for your points, which I thought were all spot on. And I have to tell you, after seeing the global diagram for pasta movements, I'm feeling very, very differently about the whole wheat orzo from Italy. I managed to get at the grocery store this morning, so thank you for that. I'm wondering mostly about the policy response. And maybe Atsuko can also comment a little bit more on that. And I think, quite rightly, she says it's not exactly a global supply chain issue in Africa. It's more national and regional, but we know, during the Ebola crisis, and especially during the 2007, 2008, and 2012 food price crises, there was quite a lot of problem around export bans and leaders. Once they sensed that the supply chains were seizing up a little bit, seeking to halt the movement of commodities out of their country. So I'm sort of wondering I don't see a lot of discussion about this right now, but maybe within African Development Bank there is some. What are the issues, what is the agenda with national leaders and ministries of finance and trade, just to sort of encourage people to let these regional trade flows and national trade flows proceed, so that we don't have to have these supply bottlenecks any worse than they are. That's all I wanted to add right now.
Okay, thanks. Armin and then Sean.
Sorry. Just on a very micro level, talking to a colleague today in Uganda, and she was saying that in Uganda, to stop the spread, the supermarkets are open, but all the wet markets, all the small, very small markets are closed. And so I think there's some implications there that are quite important for food security, because also public transport is closed. So you have both a difficulty in people moving around to buy food, but also the small informal markets being closed and having to go to supermarkets. Also on a food security level, planting seasons being disrupted. So in the research, at least that we're doing in CIMMYT in Colombia, at the moment it should be the planting season, but a lot of that's being disrupted because you can't put people together in a bus to take them to, you know, you can only put very few people together in a bus, or you can put them all together and then risk spreading the disease because people are not having the physical distance between each other. So I think there's also a very, very sort of micro level that we should be looking at.
Yeah, very good point. Sean, and then Simon. I see people raising their hand. There's an option in the to raise your hand if you have a question. Let's use that. Thanks, Maria, also for the reminder. Sean?
Yeah, thanks, Ed. Yeah, from our side, again, at this kind of sort of granular level, it's been interesting to see that all the teams now across the different sectors that we work in at CRS are putting together a lot of guidance for our teams in the field, so that because we're running lots of group organizations, you know, farmer groups, financial savings groups, health groups, mother and child groups, all of those things are going to be impacted by this. So we're putting out a lot of guidance at the moment on how can we continue to operate in the field with communities and not put them at risk. I think that's a really important thing that we get right, and that you know, we have communications and kind of some way of sharing that information with lots of people. I know that the savings and loans guys, they put out the first guidance. Now they have more than 4 million active people that they're working with at the moment. They're hoping to get to 3 million people with that guidance. So, you know, that's a pretty immediate way that we can respond and get to lots of people with, you know, helpful tips. Second thing, though, I think is just what has been really interesting is that, you know, life has kind of ground to a halt in some ways, but we're using digital communications, you know, kind of 12, 14 hours a day now. And whether that's, you know, rapidly talking to people about, you know, immediate issues or planning and designing projects for the future, it seems as though the platforms that we're using now are much better than they were before. And like this meeting now, people can get together and communicate, share, and sort of progress things pretty effectively. And I just wonder what the implications of that will be. I think, as Arwen has said, though, you know, one of the other implications of this is that, you know, there are a community of people who can use financial transactions and are sharing, you know, money and sending, you know, basic amounts around. But there will be a pretty large segment of the poorest people who are not in that financial transaction market, and I think they are, you know, going to be put under a lot of pressure with this situation. Over.
Yeah, I think your sound was not very good, Sean, but I think we got what you said. Maybe next time you come in, maybe, I don't know if you can tweak something. But Simon, and then Ed.
Okay, thanks. Just a couple of additional points from my side. Just following up on the point about trade interruptions. There's been interesting stuff in the media in the last couple of days about Vietnam and rice. I don't know how many on the call have been following that, but 2 days ago they were saying no export bans. Now they're saying temporary export bans and so on. So you are seeing some activity there, and I think I agree with, you know, Johannes, I think, and others, that you know, this is an area where policy advice, perhaps, or you know, policy influencing and so on could play an important role. The second thing where I think there's a policy angle is around what it means to be providing key services or essential services. And this comes more perhaps to a couple of areas, one which I haven't heard mentioned that much, which is the sort of labor-intensive parts of the value chain. So where you have pack houses or labor-intensive manufacturing in mills or factories of food and so on. You know, what's the guidance in terms of employees showing up to work? You know, how do they keep safe in those work environments where, often people are working very, very close to each other in, production settings and so on. And then, is that all shut down, or are there guidances about how to do that in a kind of safe way? And so on. Syngenta, the business that funds our foundation, is having exactly these kinds of discussions right now so that business continuity can be continued in a safe way. And I suspect a lot of major, international companies are doing that. But, what about local SMEs? What kind of guidance are they getting, and what direction are they getting? And then my third point is also related to this, which is, we're having to pull back a lot of our field work at the moment in terms of advising farmers and supporting entrepreneurs in the field, again, because of, travel bans or, stay home directives. But some of this is critical for food production and the food supply chains. And again, from a policy perspective, can we look at some of these things and create advice around these being essential services as well, and with appropriate guidance, exempted from some of those bans. Over.
Maybe just because I'm the moderator, I sometimes have some privilege, no? But Simon, maybe are you also using a lot of these like digital tools for extension? Because you mentioned the element of extension.
Yes, we are. I mean, we're supporting, a lot of our field agent networks using digital tools, and I think there are lots of opportunities there. I mean, maybe we'll come to that a bit later in the call, but yes, and particularly from a kind of scaling perspective, I think there's a lot of opportunities to leverage. But maybe let's return to that a bit later.
Great, Ed, and then Michael.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity. From a policy angle, I see it useful to divide these effects into kind of three categories. First, kind of the immediate effects, intermediate and long term. So I think of, the immediate effects already being felt now is shelves are emptying out in supermarkets, and only the ones with high incomes can buy food and hoard, and other people are left out there with very minimal food. So that's one first level immediate effects. On the intermediate term, it's really this shock in global supply chains that, as the pipeline of food is drying out, some of these effects will be only felt maybe 6 months to a year on. However, the long-term effects, which I'm worried about and might not get enough immediate attention, is that really the derailment of development and investments in agricultural sector, as governments with limited resources and budgets have to move money from, agriculture maybe to health sectors. You're already seeing quite a lot of shift in, interest and focus, reallocation of resources that are moving, much needed resources from agriculture to the more immediate needs in health and security. So I think that's what we also need to pay a little bit of attention to, because not enough people are paying attention to that side, because it feels like it's a long-term problem. I think these shocks, for example, in the input supply systems, seed, fertilizer, will only be felt, and research and development might be felt 2 or 3 years down the line. But, if you encourage governments to actually plan with those in mind, you might mitigate against. The last point I wanted to contribute to is on the labor disruptions. I do see that, maybe food systems that are more dependent on family labor production as much as smallholder farmers, to the extent that this pandemic is affecting mostly older people, I do see less of a disruption there. It's really when areas where there's concentrated labor, where people are in, pack houses and facilities like that, that are likely to be disrupted. But I think for family-based production systems, you are likely to see less of a disruption in those as, kind of business and production continues as usual. But I think all these paying attention to immediate, intermediate and long-term effects is a very good lens to advise governments and policymakers. Thank you.
Okay, Michael, you're an author of a very interesting blog also. I don't know, are you going to talk about that, or? But the floor is yours. I hope so.
Thanks, and Johannes, thank you very much. Enlightening and straight to the point presentation. A few additions. First, the distinction between high value kind of supply chains and staples. I think it's really critical for Kenya, and that's where I'm calling from, and that's where we live and work. The rose sector, the entire flower industry, is really at the brink of of a disaster. Many thousand laborers are being set free, and basically because the European export markets kind of collapse, or kind of reduce their demand drastically. And so far, and then that brings me to the distinction between urban and rural areas. So far, the rural areas have kind of were seen as a safe haven. So many people from the cities are moving into rural areas. But then we already discussed planting seasons or touched on that. The question is seed systems and seed delivery and seed supply. Kind of an interesting question would be at some point a distinction between, or whether there's a difference between open pollinated varieties and a tight dependency on hybrids. So that's the second point. The third one I'd like to make around the export bans. I think it's really important to look at national and regional trade more closely. Kenya depends heavily on maize, and it depends on maize from Uganda and Tanzania. So if these borders close, and we have seen first signs yesterday in Kyrgyzstan, and I think Vietnam, wheat and rice respectively, if that is being repeated in the region here, then we simply have a supply issue. And maize is a very good commodity to study what's going to happen. And fourth, the policy response. The government yesterday, Kenyan government yesterday, reduced the VAT from 16 to 14%. I think, which is also meant to make food a bit more available. It's probably not enough, and everyone focuses currently on health. There's little preparedness with regard to making food available, mitigating disruptions of value chains. Not that I've spoken to a couple of people in the system, UN and NGOs. There's nothing happening at the moment that is of significance in terms of preparedness. And you refer to the block. The big worry really are the high density areas. Talking of a few million people in a couple of major cities like Kisumu, Mombasa, and Nairobi. Their purchasing power is at risk, as they can't move as they have moved in the past to work. So that's yeah. Very last point is at technical level. I think we would be able to address some of these issues. There's also a software issue that I'd like to bring to this discussion. That's the trust amongst people. There's really, and it's anecdotal, but I observe an erosion of trust amongst people, because people fear that one of their neighbors got it, and that's the worst thing that can happen for value chain, I believe, and the distribution and allocation of services in future. So I'll stop here. So thanks for having me.
Thanks. Just one note. If you see the list of participants there, if you click there, there's an icon to raise your hand. This is what you can use. You can also, of course, ask your question or your contribution via the chat, right? Okay, Ernst, then Florence, and then Martin. Ernst, we don't hear you.
Microphone.
Ernst, otherwise
you're muted, Ernst. You need to click the microphone.
Sorry very much. So the Ebola epidemic has been quite strong here in West Africa. I'm working for Africa Rice. And so we have this experience, and the task force on Corona is now pushing the institute that we start producing the maximum of seeds what is possible. And I think we have to focus on this, especially when Vietnam and other countries start to say, there is no problem of food supply for Africa, and half of the African rice consumption is imported from Asia. So we should surely all focus much more on food security in our respective countries. And I'm sure this will give a push to this. And Michael, you talked about Kenya, and I work there also. I see in quite a lot of African countries that the smallholders are quite old people. So when this Corona crisis is going really through the full landscape, we will have completely new family structures who are running the business in, let's say, 10 months. So we might have to change even our ways of communicating to people, because this will no more be the old father doing the milk in Kenya or producing the rice in Cote d'Ivoire. This will be a young person, or maybe we have to ask ourselves, is there continuity in this production? When I have been with the coffee farmers in Kenya, they all said, when we are dying, nobody will grow coffee anymore. So I think this will give us a demographic situation where we have up to now no clue what will happen.
Yeah, thanks. So you're really saying, Ernst, that we cannot go back to the business as usual as before. We're really moving into a new normal, right? And how do we prepare for that? Thanks, Florence and Martin. Florence.
Sure. So my organization, we only do extension work in agroecology, and so as Simon mentioned, we're also seeing our programs affected by that. So our extension agents aren't able to get out to the farms as they usually would. They're able to compensate for that somewhat with text messages and internet communication, but since we work in such remote areas, there's definitely limitations there for how much of that communication is actually able to happen. So we're taking the opportunity for some capacity building on our staff, since they do have internet access, and it's an opportunity for them to do some learning that they can then take to the farmers once they're able to get back out to their communities. And as far as the 3,000 smallholder farmers that are in our network, we're not seeing a lot of impact on them, maybe not as much as in some places, because they grow certain crops to sell, and that's more difficult now connecting to the markets, of course, but they also grow all of the foods to feed themselves and their small communities, and so they're really protected from food insecurity in that regard in their little communities, at least. And well, I guess that's most food is produced by these smallholder farmers, so I think there's a lot of potential there, and also because they're using agroecology practices, they have a very they get certain materials from outside, but really what they rely on is all right there on the farm already, and so the lack of access to inputs isn't affecting their ability to produce. So that's just a little bit of what we've observed from our program.
Thanks, Martin. Martin, and then Julie. Martin, we don't hear you. Martin, otherwise, maybe Julie, you want to come in and then we do try Martin afterwards?
I'm sorry, and this is Martin. I'm sorry, my microphone was muted and I was talking for like the last 30 seconds. So
it doesn't count.
So what I was saying is that I'd like to add my voice to those of every other person to thank Johannes and also Lennart for convening this meeting and for getting us thinking about how do we mitigate the impact of COVID-19 that is definitely good, is coming. I just want to draw your attention, as Ernst has also done, to previous efforts to also mitigate epidemics or financial crisis or a food crisis. If you recall, in 2008, there was a food crisis where the price of food just went through the roof. 2009, there was the financial crisis, and then in 2014 was the Ebola crisis. And the African Development Bank actually developed, strategies and documents, detailed documents on, on how to address those problems. And I'm sure the World Bank also probably has something similar to that. And then the African and the Inter-American Bank, Development Bank also, and the Asian Development Bank. It would be worthwhile putting up some of these documents and just look at maybe, of course, the context is different and the time is different. But sometimes the processes and also even the approaches might still be useful. So as we think of how to approach this, might be worth looking back, into history and seeing what has been done. Thank you.
Yeah, good points. Julie? Julie Howard?
I think she's muted.
There we go. Okay. Yeah. So I wanted to respond a little bit to Martin and also to I thought Ed's categories, the 3 categories, are actually very useful, right? So what do we think about needing to be done in the immediate, medium, and longer term? In the immediate, and also responding to what Martin just said, I think, as many of you have pointed out, the risk of large-scale shortages because global trade or regional trade gets shut off very quickly is real. And thinking, Martin, about the experiences maybe from 2007, 2008, I remember at that time in Washington, I mean, there was a full-on effort by the World Bank and other regional development banks, to try and reach out directly to Asian leaders and try and prevent the hoarding of rice stocks. So I don't know. I think we need to think hard about who and what organizations can play that role today. I'm not sure it's the World Bank. But I mean, African Development Bank may be able to step up and play quite a large role. I mean, especially given the strong reputation of Akin. So I think that bears thinking about. To me, that's in the immediate phase. Unfortunately, I don't see a lot of leadership from the U.S. coming from that right now. We're so consumed with our own crisis right now. It's hard to see how we'll be able to think globally for a few weeks at least. So in the medium and longer term, I think, Ed, again, you're quite right to think about, well, what happened during Ebola and what was effective. And I looked back quickly to see what was USAID's and other donor responses, FAO responses during Ebola. And it was around, trying to get supply chains working. I think Johannes's note about the green chains in China, trying to assure supply chains of key agricultural areas into the cities is important. It's going to look different in places where we work, but just thinking about, okay, in Kenya and Uganda, what would it mean to assure that supply chain? What would be needed? It may mean cash transfusions to truckers, to other people who are involved with marketing process. It may mean sort of special rules on transit to facilitate the transit of those special goods. I'm not quite sure, but that seems to have worked well in China, and that also seems to have been something that was done in Ebola times as well. Other things, input vouchers, try and get money in the hands of farmers so that and to try and keep the input dealers alive so that there's not a delayed impact of in the next season's planting. So that was something that was done during the Ebola crisis. So those are some of the ideas that have come out already that we've had some experience with under Ebola and during the 2008-9 crisis, 2007, 2008. I think a couple of things may be in our favor right now if we can exploit them a little bit better. One, we've already talked about the use of digital technologies as a substitute for human beings. But at another level, how do we exploit access to data to know where where the outbreak is worse, and where supply chains and where hunger issues are the worst. So I think we're in a much better position now than we were even 5 years ago to think about how can we use mobile phones, self-reporting, crowdsourcing information to better direct aid resources, to get food, to unblock supply chains, that kind of thing. I note that Africa now has its own centers for disease control. So, supporting them, to get information out about how outbreaks are proceeding and intensifying across the continent, and having agricultural ministries sort of begin to work more closely with them to translate, well, what can that mean for, what do we expect in terms of supply issues in those affected areas? I think, Lennart, when you set up this session, you also challenged us to think about, well, how might we use this opportunity to make some of the larger systemic changes that need to be made in agriculture and food systems. And Johannes already mentioned the issue of food safety and needing to be more active on, especially on in wet markets and food safety in wet markets, and looking at the transmission of disease between animals and people. But it's a broader, I think, opportunity to put more focus on food safety and also a broader opportunity to put more focus on what does it take to improve dietary diversity, production diversity, and dietary diversity for broader health impacts. That was all.
All right, thanks. Yeah, I was also thinking about if you look at the new normal. I think now we are a lot of development happens through projects, right? Coming in from outside with international experts flying in and having teams here in Africa and in the region. Maybe this will also change, that there's really much more focus on local ownership and independence from these foreign forces that want things, right? I'm not sure, maybe Julie, do you know if you've also been looking at some blogs, do you see the donor community already responding? Let's say, okay, we're going to divert monies from here to there. I think Ed or somebody else alluded to this already locally, that governments were moving money to health. Do you see this happening?
I'm sure there's going to be that pressure. I think you and others are absolutely right that we have to guard against that, definitely.
Okay.
Sorry, just on that point, if I may, Lennart, is it okay?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. To Julie's point, actually, for the financial institutions, we're all now looking at repurposing, so your point is very pertinent. Either the governments are requesting for policy-based operations for budget support because there's so much social protection that needs to go in immediate liquidity. And that, to Martin's point, draws away from agriculture, but each one of our interventions also has to have some sort of connection with this crisis and the touch point between what's happening with global regional value chains, especially from the private sector perspective. I think somebody made the point that subsistence farmers and smallholder farmers may be somewhat isolated from the problem, except from the macroeconomic perspective. There will be inflationary pressure, but from the private sector perspective, where it's all about the markets, there's a huge impact and interface that needs to be made.
Yeah, very good point. Simon, you want to contribute to that?
Sure. So I just wanted to add a point which I think is really important here. Again, as we think about guidance to funders and programmers as they think about these shifts of emphasis, and that's really to look for the and rather than the or the either. So just to give you an example of one of the things that we're busy working on right now in India, one of the things we've set up is and we're in the process of scaling, it's one of our scaling examples, so it's very relevant to this discussion, is a large network of field agents that work directly with smallholders in remote communities, those communities that are not well served by the existing retail networks and the private sector networks. Because why? Because the farmers are too poor. So we've got this network of field agents that provide a combination of advisory services and products and market access and financial access. Well, we're now exploring how to use these field agents and starting to test out, how they can do screening, how they can do training for, people to be safe in their homes and, healthy and so on. They could potentially then be, deliverers of other, health-related products or health-related services and so on. So where there are these kinds of networks and where there are kind of, let's say, scaling platforms of different kinds, it doesn't have to be ours. I mean, it could be similar kinds of things that maybe are cross-sectoral or could be made cross-sectoral with a bit of a nudge. I think that's something really worth looking at seriously. And I think often gets missed because you have the silos. The health ministry thinks about, clinics, and, agriculture thinks about extension agents, and, energy thinks about, energy distribution networks. But actually, when you're talking about, local presence in rural communities, why couldn't it one be the other? It just needs a bit of a tweak.
Yeah, thanks. I think, Johannes, I want to bring it back to you. I think we talked about the short and the long-term implications of this COVID-19 on ARD. I think we talked about the level of the farmers, and the farmers also as laborers, right? They have to go to the field and have to do all the harvesting at a specific time, and also in the intermediaries and the whole processing business kind of. We talked about the role of the governments and also about the donors in the short and the long, and even the medium term. We added that. For you, Johannes, I mean, you already submitted your report to IFAD, I'm afraid, but what was for you maybe new or surprising from this discussion, or maybe your takeaways from today where you thought, okay, I wish I had included that, but it's too late now.
Thank you very much, Lennart. Let me thank you on all our behalfs, I think, who participated, to you for organizing us, because I think this, to me at least, this was very insightful. I can't pretend that I'm going to give you a summary of what I heard, because it's been too rich and frankly very diverse, which is good, because I think one of the important aspects of this crisis is that it's so broad gauged in its input that we really have to develop strong peripheral vision. I guess what I come away from, among others, is the question, so, where is actually at the moment the sort of core group of experts, policymakers, and whatever that focuses on the question that we have been discussing here? Is it the CFS? I think it's called the CFS. There's Food Security, Committee on Food Security, that I understand met once and had quite a useful discussion. Maybe they've met more often in Rome. You're probably more familiar with that, Julie, for example, than I am. But should they be in the lead on this, or is it maybe what are you guys in the CIGIR community doing as a community, with maybe somebody taking over some lead role on this? Maybe the Secretariat, I don't know. What about the MDBs? I'm very grateful to have ADB here, African Development Bank, participating. What are you guys doing as a group? Is the bank, the World Bank, the African, Asian, and so on, are you all actually, do you have a forum where you now work together and where maybe you can share I've not seen anything now, I'm the wrong person probably, but it strikes me, we are a somewhat eclectic group of people focused on scaling, and if there's a follow-up, actually, I would want to think more about, so what can we as a group contribute to this, what is really now a challenge of delivery at scale in many different dimensions, time dimensions, and I was very grateful to the contribution on the short-term versus medium versus long-term, because that was absolutely right as a way to help us organize our thinking. But it's also sectoral, it's cross-sectoral, it's, there are lots of issues, and how a response at scale can be thought about. I thought the issue of interruptions because of export constraints is a real risk, and how to approach that. Maybe that's where the G20 needs to take a much stronger role. I learned this morning from my Russian language teacher that Russia has just imposed a export control on groats. I didn't even know what groats are, but I'm sure all of you know what groats are. So, these are issues that I think really need some really well-focused, and not just at sort of individual country or agency level, but I think, I see a real challenge here to our global governance system, in this case, particularly in the area of agricultural development and food security. And I think it cries out for some leadership. Now, in my view, by the way, if all of you are thinking about writing and blogs and so on, I think maybe this is a topic where we can chime in with perhaps some impact individually and as a group, because it strikes me if we don't get some leadership across institutions, across issues here, you know, I'm just worried that we individually would all have not be able to need that broader impact that we, I think, need to have. Let me stop here and thank you all for participating on my behalf, but hand it back over to you, Lennart, and maybe Julie and others who want to close it off. I need to run in a couple of minutes, unfortunately, but thank you very, very much. We should discuss, by the way, I think, Lennart, distilling what we heard into some kind of a set of notes of key points that we take away, I think would be useful. So I would like to do that with somebody's help, perhaps. Thank you.
Excellent. Yeah, we'll do that together. I'll help you. If there are any people that have some comments or contributions to it, they can also email to me and Johannes, and we can put this all together. Julie, you want to say something before we close down? No, okay. So I think.
Sorry. Yeah, no, and I'm happy to contribute as well on notes. And I think Johannes is right. If we could come up with perhaps a joint set of points from this group, it would be more powerful than a whole bunch of individual blogs if we can organize ourselves to do that. I'm going to reach out to, since we don't have anybody from USAID on this call, I'm going to reach out to them too, just to see, you know, what the discussion is on some of these policy issues, and to see if we can get any kind of input from them. I think that's what I'll commit to doing today.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Great discussion.
Yeah, Julie and Simon and Johannes and Larry for really initiating this. There's also an idea even to have a bit more regular talks about the topic of Corona. Maybe the situation is totally different in 1 month. But thanks again to Johannes. I think I heard only one cough during the whole virtual call. So anyway, it was good that we met virtually and not in real life. So I think everybody can be at ease now. So thank you so much, and we'll be sharing the recording and the notes. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.